So let's go ahead and get started. So let's start with a little bit of a discussion on the psychological egoism and tribalism ideas, tribal ethics ideas, just to sort of kick things off, since I didn't really get a chance to talk to you guys about that last week. What's fundamentally important about last week's module, or the week's lesson, is that that is not a desired place to be, right? So that was understood, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that was just a statement of our starting point. Where is it that people come from before moving into making purposeful decisions about how to live their lives, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's what psychological egoism and tribal ethics is all about. It's not really a discussion at all about this is how we should be, or it's not broke, so let's not worry about fixing it type of thing. It's not that at all. In fact, we want to get kind of as far away from psychological egoism as we can. But it's important to know that that's where a lot of our kind of ideas about what it means to be a good person comes from. And it also is, it's good to be able to juxtapose that, because of the fact that we spend so much time making decisions about how to live our lives, that we sort of forget that there are thousands of decisions that we've made throughout our lives where we didn't actually put any effort into the thought. We just sort of defaulted to a way of thinking. So when we think of things like psychological egoism, we can think of that as a default, that this is what we fall back on when we're not thinking about ethics, when we're not thinking about making good decisions, and we're just making kind of those snap judgments. If we don't have a system in place that's well established and practiced, then we're going to fall back into psychological egoism, and we're going to make tons of decisions. If you don't know, and I don't, I'm not trying to call people out on this, but if someone doesn't understand what a moral concept is in the world, a moral situation, a circumstance in which they need to make a decision that has moral components, if they don't realize that, if it doesn't strike them as something that has a requirement that our ethical system needs to be in play, then again, they're going to default back to this psychological egoism. Movies and entertainment, a lot of our entertainment movies kind of play on our psychological egoism. It's, how common is it? Pretty much every other movie that's ever been made has had a character that had to make a decision between the family member that or friend or whatever who's about to die or get hurt or being tortured or whatever. They have to decide between their well-being or the well-being of everybody else, right? So I'm going to torture your friend here until you give me the nuclear codes. Oh, stop, here's the codes. Go kill everybody, right? So these kinds of ideas are so visceral that even the entertainment that we consume falls back on these, because for a lot of people it's comfortable. It's comfortable to have their default played to. It's harder to get your head wrapped around someone who's making a decision based on a consequentialist set of ideas or a deontological set of ideas, or even a virtuous set of ideas. If you don't have the training, that's going to look really weird. For the vast majority of us, we don't have that kind of training, and therefore, seeing people out there helping out their friends and their family over and above everyone else just feels a little more right, because it's kind of how our psychology is geared. And it takes a lot of work to break some of those habits, right? In the same way that it takes a lot of work to eat healthy, or any other thing where we have to sort of go against what our natural tendencies might be, right?
Right.
So the expansion of psychological egoism, which is kind of this idea that I am the center of the world, right? Just to kind of sum it up, right? I am the center of the world, and I have two primary focuses in my life. The first is survival. Survival at all costs, depending on how far into the default you allow yourself to go, right? So think an animal that doesn't have young, right? That animal is going to immediately default to survival at the expense of all other things. That's kind of, I mean, we are animals. We will fall into that if we don't have something in place to sort of take us out of that mode. Once you start putting in place some of these things, but we're still not going into things like training or systematization. But now we're putting in place things that might change how our egoism affects us, right? So this might be something like a family or a community. Once we become part of a family or a community, are communal. Human beings, as as natural creatures, are communal. That is our kind of primary mode. We're not herd animals as much as people like to throw around. We're not, but we are communal. We're not. We're also not wolves, right? We don't have that kind of nature either. But humans do have that kind of in between that kind of herd mentality and that pack mentality. And it's called communal mentality. This is not entirely unlike rats, right? We're very much like rats when it comes to our the way that we view community. That means that we're more than happy in the default. We're more than happy to sacrifice each other for our own good when survival is not immediately at stake, right? That's overt in psychological egoism, but it becomes kind of minimized. It becomes less of a concern when we start talking about tribal ethics. Once we start getting into these communities, we start becoming reliant on each other, and that reliance breeds in an interest in other people's well-being is the wrong kind of word. We might say their integrity, their physical integrity. I need this person to exist in order for them to provide me with whatever it is that I rely on them for. So therefore, I should do what's within my power to ensure their physical safety or whatever. All right. So tribal ethics takes that a little bit further, and it starts. It's concerned with concentricity is the term, but basically spheres of influence is the easiest way to put it. Right? We have this kind of idea that the egoist, I should say, the psychological egoist, which is where we all start. I am the most important thing in the world. Absolutely, right? That's my default. My default is I am the most important thing in the world. Those things that are immediately considered a part of my being are very, very close. So much so that they may as well be considered a part of my person. So children are often fall into this kind of lump, right? For us as communal entities, we mate for life. Take that for what it's worth. We've broken a lot of our natural instincts, but our human instinct, is to mate for life, because our young are incapable of caring for themselves for so long. It takes us a long time to raise a child. So with these kind of natural elements in play, our nuclear family, that family in which we have a mate and children, um, for all intents and purposes, in a tribal ethics kind of point of view, is us. When I say me, I'm concerned with my well-being and my good. I mean my immediate nuclear family, right? These are elements that are necessary for me to survive in the long term, right? To continue on past my own death. So, tribal ethics is kind of taking that role. There is the you, the sphere of influence that is you. The next kind of sphere, the next concentric circle that sort of goes around that is this idea of family that we more commonly use in modern language. We talk about family. So this will be things like brothers and sisters, parents, anyone where you've actually had a life with those people, not grandparents, not aunts and uncles, unless they actually lived with you and grew up with you, right? Then those people become part of the family. But for the purposes of tribal ethics, we're talking about those people who were instrumental or who are currently instrumental in either your upbringing or your well-being, but who aren't part of your procreative capacity to extend into the future, right? So, like I said, parents, brothers, sisters, family member, extended family members that live with you and are part of your familial circle. That's the next sphere. The next sphere after that is those extended family members. These are people who share blood. The way that humans view blood relation is something that's kind of interesting in the sense that it's not like other animals. So this is one area where other animals and humans are a bit different, but in a good way. Other animals, instead of having the blood relations concern like humans do, might choose to destroy those that are possibly competitive, even if they are of the same blood. So we don't do that. Instead, if we share blood, then there is a connectivity there, and we consider that part of our sphere. Now, the extended family sphere can be pretty big, and there can be people that are closer or further away within that circle. So, a treasured grandparent you might go out of your way for, whereas a distant, second or third cousin that you've never met, if they showed up on your doorstep, you might try to help them, but you're not going to send them a Christmas card, right? Outside of that, then we start getting into just the bucket that we call friends, right? This can be pretty big, but it can't be like what a lot of modern people think of as friends isn't the same as the sphere of influence that includes friends. The kind of friends that we're talking about are those people whom you have chosen to be like family, right? So these are people that you treat well and would go out of your way for, even though there's no blood, all right? Unless you happen to have coworkers that you really adore, it doesn't include people like coworkers or others that maybe you see every day, go to lunch with or whatever, your drinking buddies or whatever. Any of that kind of stuff doesn't count unless these are people that you would go out of your way for, right? Would you sign on to be their kid's godparent, etc., that kind of stuff. Outside of that is the sphere of acquaintances, which is more inclusive. That includes these people that are coworkers or people that you see at the store every day, etc. Let you know their name, you know their face, you would recognize them. You've maybe had some interesting conversations time to time, or you rely on them in some way for work or for school or whatever. So that sphere is kind of, for lack of a better term, is massive, right? These are all the people whose name and face you know and who know you, right? But aren't friends, aren't those people that you would go out of your way for. Outside of that, the spheres start to get a little more nebulous. The spheres that I've kind of defined up to this point have pretty strict definitions on how people are kind of pigeonholed into them. But once you get outside the sphere of acquaintances, it really depends on culture and upbringing. So, for instance, in the United States, the idea surrounding the concept of patriotism is, I mean, it's a pill that we swallow. Americans are nationalistic. We find our identity as Americans, with exception, of course, but in general, Americans tend to view being American as an important part of their identity. This isn't common, right? There are lots of nations in which this is not the case, especially when you consider that with only a few exceptions, most nations are a fraction of the size, both in population and in raw space. Now, part of that is because we view ourselves as Americans and we don't view ourselves in the strict. It's fairly rare. You will find some people, but it's rare. People who will identify themselves as a member of their state more than they do as Americans, right? There's lots of people who will say, well, I'm a Nevadan or I'm a Texan or whatever. But when it comes down to it, they're Americans and they're happy to say, no, I'm an American. I wouldn't say that I'm a Texan and not an American. Like I said, there are some exceptions, but they're fairly rare. That isn't the only sphere that might come into play. For some people, their neighborhood might be where it starts. If you live in a neighborhood in which, for whatever reason, being a part of that neighborhood is an important part of your identity, but you don't know very many people who live there, then you might identify more closely and go and consider the people who live in your neighborhood more highly than you would other Americans or whatever, right? If you are part of a religious community or a culture in which there is some degree of exclusivity, but that you don't necessarily interact with the people that are a part of it. So this is very different from local church groups. Local church groups are going to fall into that either friends or acquaintances sphere. But if you're part of a massive church, some mega church or something like that, or you're part of a religious culture in which there's you hold your religious culture higher than your national culture or your local culture, then you might identify with that. Or point being, there's a point past acquaintances when we start talking about people whose face you don't know and who you've never met. Who would you help first? Would you help someone who's a member of your church, if it's this massive conglomerate? Or would you help people who are a member of your nation? Or would you help people who are a member of XYZ, whatever that happens to be? And that's what this is all about. Tribal ethics is all about who would you prioritize when it comes time to act, right? If I have to take an action that benefits other people, who do I benefit first? Well, within the tribal ethics framework, I would benefit myself and my immediate nuclear family. I would benefit myself first, then my immediate family, right? Mother, father, sisters, brothers, and those blood relations that you grew up with or currently live with. Then we get into extended family, blood. Then we get into friends, people who are family by choice, if you will. Then we get into acquaintances, people that we have connections with that we know by face and name, but aren't necessarily close to. And then our community, whatever we identify that community as. And these circles go out and out, further and further. Now, what's interesting is that this is not a new concept. This isn't something that came about, when psychology became a topic of conversation. This is something that was written about 2,500 years ago or so. And the name, the term tribal ethics, comes from that. Modern times, we tend to talk about it slightly differently. We call it survival ethics as opposed to tribal. But when Aristotle was writing about this stuff back in the pre-AD era, 325 BC, he was talking about it from the perspective of city-states, right? So his theory was quite simple. You cannot consider someone important to you out beyond the realm of about 10,000 people, right? Anybody outside of that, those concentric circles of connectivity, you can't consider them as one more important than another unless they have some kind of delineation, right? 10,000 people is the most people that we can track and care about. And psychologically, this theory seems pretty strong. We haven't been able to disprove it, but it's one of those kinds of things where it's as a negation theory. You can prove it right 1,000,000 times, but it only takes one time proving it wrong, and then it'll be wrong, right? So as a psychological theory, it's a little weak, but it stands. Right now, we haven't been able to say that it's false. No human being has been able to keep logical track of more than about 10,000 people ever, and care about them in any kind of realistic way, right? There's always something that creates a delineation. Now, the thing about psychological ethics and tribal ethics are that these are not desired outcomes. These are not where we want people to be. It's just where we're starting. It's where everybody is, not where they should be, right? That difference between psychology and philosophy. The is versus ought. The is that we all start from a psychological standpoint. We all have instincts, communal instincts on how we deal with other people, and it's based on how close they are to us and how much we care about them, right? And depending on how crass you want to be, it has to do with how useful they are to you, right? So, like I said, there's not a place where we want to be. We want to be someplace where we care about people regardless of whether they benefit us or not. We care about people because they're people, and they deserve it. They deserve it from the standpoint of just being human. And that we want to be good people because from the standpoint of, that's our desired end state. So, where do we go from there? So that's why we kind of spend an entire week on this. We need to know where that starting point is in order for ethical egoism, which is what we're going to talk about tonight, to make any sense. Now, I'm going to start with this. Ethical egoism is a discredited system. Or I should say it's an unpopular system. It's kind of hard to say that an ethical theory can be discredited, but it's a system that's unpopular. It has been shown through counter-argument enough times to be false, to not lead to positive outcomes, that for the most part, people just don't see ethical egoism as a viable ethical system. That doesn't mean that it's not useful. And it also doesn't mean that we shouldn't talk about it. It just means that ethical egoism isn't necessarily as rigorous. It doesn't stand up to scrutiny as well as what we're going to study later on in the term. But we need to talk about it because ethical egoism is the baby steps out of psychological egoism. Okay? So you've got to, for those of you that are parents, you know this all too well. But for anyone that's had to deal with the growing pains of teaching a child to be a decent human being, we realize that there's a process by which you have to teach someone to consider other people, not necessarily at the exclusion of themselves, but in addition to themselves, right? And sometimes that takes more work than not. It just kind of depends on the mentality and disposition of the child. But it still has to happen. And this has been something that parents have been doing time immemorial, right? If you don't raise a child to be communal, to care about other people, then they become destructive, and that usually leads to being self-destructive, and that leads to a very short life. In the times before we had ethical systems to care about, we had basic for survival to deal with, right? So a child doesn't last very long in a survival of the fittest / might makes right environment. They don't have it yet. They can't be mighty at that level. They can be belligerent and they can be troublesome, but they can't be mighty. They can't crush others to their will. So you have to teach them to be better. You have to teach them to be the kind of people that consider others. And in order to do that, you have to kind of be careful. You have to be careful about how quickly you try to walk them out of that. And that's where ethical egoism comes into play. Now, it's an unfortunate truth that in the world, it's also where a lot of people stop. The vast majority of people stop at a kind of ethical egoism. It's usually fairly incomplete, because in order to be a complete ethical egoist, you will have to have studied and practiced ethics at some point. And by study, I don't mean necessarily you have to sit down and read a bunch of philosophy books and stuff like that. What I do mean is that you have to have considered what an ethical life means in a meaningful way, and kind of tested whatever theories you've come up with, right? Most people don't bother with that. They, as they're growing up, they take the smacks on the hand and they say, okay, I'm going to use this as kind of my bowling bumpers. If I bounce too close to this and I get popped, that means that I need to go back the other direction. And they do that long enough until they sort of have a general direction of travel. Then they just stay there. They don't bother putting any effort into it. And for the most part, that's not that bad. It's okay. As long as they consider other people, then that's a pretty good way of looking at the world. It's just not as good as it could be. And that's what ethical egoism is all about. Ethical egoism is about, it's a good move away from psychological egoism, but it's not necessarily where we want to be. It's not as a system, it's not consistent enough, and it's not robust enough to be able to handle situations that we as modern human beings need to be able to handle. So what is then ethical egoism? Got enough people now that if somebody wants to take a stab at that, I'd be interested to hear what you think ethical egoism is.
You keep cutting out because there's some background noise from another person up here, and I can't hear what you're saying.
All right, let's try that. Is that better? So do you have a guess? What do you think in a sound bite? What do you think ethical egoism is as compared to this kind of psychological ideal that we've been throwing around?
I think that ethical egoism is the idea of how one should be, where psychological egoism is kind of the theory that people are innately selfish.
Right. Okay. Good. That is generally correct, with one exception, or at least one addition that I would want to add. Ethical egoism is assuming, under the assumption that people are going to be selfish, it is better to be ethically selfish than to be psychologically selfish, right? That's really what it's coming down to. People are generally selfish. We don't have, it's just the way that our brains work. It's the way that our senses work. Everything kind of comes in through our senses and through our experience. And therefore, without me, there is no world, right? The world doesn't exist unless I'm there to sense it, as far as I'm concerned. So taking that concept and making it such that when I look at the world, I realize that that's true of everyone else. That every single person looks at the world through themselves as the experiencer, and that the world doesn't exist when they're not experiencing it. And therefore, the end of their ability to experience the world is the end of the world, quite literally, right? So how do you do that? If you know that this is how people are, how do you do this in a way that keeps people from being assholes? How do you do that? Well, it's, oddly enough, pretty hard. And it requires taking people out of their comfort zone, where the vast majority, there are no exceptions. People view themselves as really important. Even those people who don't particularly like themselves, or who have certain afflictions and whatnot that cause them to doubt their worth and all that, they still experience the world through their filter. And therefore, when someone who is committed, not necessarily someone who's interested or who's considering, but someone who's committed to suicide, is in effect interested in destroying the world, right? From their point of view, they are ending the world, because as the experiencer of that world, once their ability to experience it is gone, it's gone. The world is gone, right? So once we kind of get our head wrapped around that idea, we can see that for every single human being, there's good reason for us to consider ourselves to be the center of the universe. But how do we do that in such a way as to live well? Well, there's the hard way and there's the easy way. And the easy way is to just create an environment, especially for children to grow up in, or for communities and whatnot to follow, that puts in place, doesn't have to necessarily be consequences. Consequences tend to be the way that we go, but it isn't the only way to do it. But put into effect consequences for doing things that are counter to a communal nature, right? So punishments is usually the way to go. Sometimes we can do it with more positive reinforcements, positive reinforcements. So we might reward good behavior, either in children or in others. We might punish bad behavior, etc. Right? And we use this to kind of create those bumpers, those bowling alley bumpers, so that as people stray, they hit the bumper and go, oh, no, that's not right. And then they head back in the correct direction. So we can take that one step further, right? So this is, when we talked about in the first week, we talked about the concept of morals versus ethics, right? The vast majority of people who live a life that doesn't follow a particular set of ethics just basically has this massive bucket of morals, right? Some of those morals they adhere to, some of them they, follow occasionally and discard when it's inconvenient, etc. But they just have this massive system of morals that just have no consistency, or you don't even know they all are what they all are. They pop up in situations, right? So how do you get that person to do things in any kind of systematized way? Ethical egoism is the answer, right? Ethical egoism is a way of allowing people to have the conceit that they are the most important entity in the world and still live a life in which other people are considered, and that the right thing to do is the things that improve the well-being of others as well as yourself. And it comes down to a single mantra. At the core of ethical egoism is take care of yourself. I'll take care of myself. You don't have to worry about me. I don't have to worry about you. But between the two of us, we can live well. We can live a good life, and we can treat each other fine, based on this kind of idea that I don't have to worry about you. You've got yourself covered, right? Now that's a gross simplification, because there's a lot that goes into that, but it really kind of comes down to that. An ethical system in which I take care of my own good without limiting your good is an egoist system, right? Now there are multiple egoist systems. I should mention that ahead of time. Some of these systems are better than others. Ethical egoism it's not a category in the same way that some of the other systems we'll learn about later are, but there are a lot of little some of them tried, some of them not so well tried systems out there. But something like hedonism is a kind of ethical egoism, right? The pursuit of pleasure at the expense of other pursuits. In a true hedonistic ethic, not a hedonistic lifestyle, we have to make sure that we make that distinction, right? Remember, in order to be ethical, in order to have an ethical system, what is the core conceit? What is the thing that has to be present in order for someone to practice ethics? You guys remember from week 1? No?
I don't know.
You have to want to be a good person, right? You have to want it. I cannot make you be an ethical person. If you want to be a good person, then finding the right kind of system is kind of the next step after that, right? So that you can be consistent. So ethical egoism is about that. It's somebody who wants to be a good person, but they don't want to have to deal with other people. They don't want to have to worry about your good, but they also don't want to hurt anybody. They're not out there to do harm. They're not out there to tromp all over everybody and to bring everybody under their coil. It's just they want to be good people, but at the core, it's themselves that they want to worry about, because it's the one thing that you have control over. We don't have control over other people. We have control over ourselves, and that's it. So an ethical egoist is someone who's trying to be a good person, but doesn't really have a desire or an interest or feel, some might even say that they feel like that they don't have the right to seek the good of someone else. How do I know what your good is, right? Now, a lot of times this, this goes awry, and there's lots of, like I said, this is a discredited system, so it has lots of counter arguments and holes, places where it's inconsistent or incompatible with a good life. But it is a good step from psychological egoism. If you've ever met the kind of curmudgeonly old, kind of pre-80s era hardworking blue-collar man, right? Grew up in this kind of breadwinner society in which masculinity was hallmarked by a strong work ethic, right? These are those people that are like, oh, kids these days are so entitled and whatnot, right? I worked for everything that I have, and if people would get off their tail and work for what they want, then I wouldn't have to pay their taxes. This kind of stuff, right? This is at its core ethical egoism. I work for what I have, and I'm willing to work hard, and I'm willing to work long, and I'm willing to suffer for my own good. And remember, our own, when we talk about in egoism, anytime we're talking about us as individuals, we're talking about that immediate sphere, right? So that includes our children and our partners. So an ethical egoist might enjoy a life in which they work very hard to earn the essentials that they need for their life, and they take a lot of pride in it, and they feel like they deserve what they have because they've worked for it. And they don't feel like they have any obligation to people who aren't part of their immediate circle. Those people should be working for their own stuff, so to speak. It doesn't always come down to stuff, but their own lifestyle. So that's kind of a glimpse, a kind of example, you might say, of someone who's trying to live an ethical egoist life. There are lots of examples of people who do it wrong or who don't get it right, even though they're trying. That's fine. That happens. No, I'm going to go out on a limb here and use an always statement, which is philosophers hate that, but never has anybody mastered an ethical system. If you have mastered it, that means that it's not rigorous enough, because there should always be room to improve. It's kind of a necessity of a system in order for that system to be robust. The only time that an ethical system can be perfect is if everyone practices. You can't be a perfect ethicist by yourself. It just doesn't work. Ethics is about our relationships with other people. So, we have ethical egoists who are out there and they're trying to take care of themselves, and they wish that other people would take care of themselves, and then everybody would be fine. Everybody would be happy and content and have what they need in life, and so on, right? Another way that we see ethical egoism in the world is through the concept of the golden rule, right? The golden rule is the ultimate ethical egoism, right? If you live your life based on the golden rule solely, then you are kind of by definition the truest case of an ethical egoist. What do I mean by that? Well, the golden rule, for those that might not necessarily have that terminology, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, right? In the kind of modern American parlance, as it's kind of taught to kids. There are more robust ways of defining golden rule, but ultimately it comes down to this. It has both a negative and a positive element. Do unto others means the things that you do to other people should be the things that you want done to you, right? but also has a negative component. Don't do things to people that you don't want done to you, right? So we have this kind of positive and negative push-pull on how we define how we interact with other people. But it is based upon your perceptions. It's based upon what you think is good or bad, right? So kind of the easiest way to sort of break people out of because I get a lot of pushback on this, and everybody who teaches this concept usually gets a lot of pushback on this, because the golden rule is, for a lot of people, the hallmark of ethical living. It's the end all and be all. If you can get a kid to really grasp onto this, then they're set. They're going to be good people. So when you tell somebody that that's an egoist way of looking at the world, and that egoism isn't a good way of looking at the world, or at least the best way, obviously you get some pushback, right? So in the case of the golden rule, it's about perception, and it's about exclusivity. And the easiest way to sort of break our initial perception of that is to just ask the simple question: how does a masochist deal with the golden rule? Would we want a masochist to follow the golden rule? I'm hoping everybody's like, oh, no, that would be bad, right? It would be really bad for us to want a masochist to treat other people the way that they want to be treated, right? Where it's useful is that it does kind of provide us with a route towards empathy, right? It requires a human being to consider another person from their perspective, right? Yes, you're mapping your own values and whatnot onto them, but at least you're taking a moment to consider them at all, which in psychological egoism doesn't happen, right? We don't consider others unless they're useful. So the golden rule is awesome in the fact that it opens one's eyes to the fact that there are other people in the world, and that they might have feelings, and they might and they matter. The problem is that it's that mapping process. We take our own view of what we think is right or wrong, good or bad, and then we ascribe that to others, in the sense that because there's nothing else to the system. We're bringing our own moral bucket to that system. So whatever your moral bucket contains is going to define how you interact with those people. So it's inconsistent, it's problematic, it can lead to seeing other people as bad people because they don't necessarily have your particular moral proclivities, etc. So it has its problems, but as a kind of stepping stone, getting out of that psychological egoism, it's awesome. It's just not where we want to stop. It's a stepping stone. It's a way out. And it's an easy way out because it opens your eyes to that empathy of considering other people as living and breathing entities with feelings and considerations, right? So the golden rule and the kind of post-industrial work ethic are kind of good ways to look at real-world examples of ethical egoism in practice, right? There are a lot of people in the world that practice a kind of ethical egoism, right? It is not considered, you'll hear me say throughout the course, this is the most commonly practiced ethical system in the world, or this is the second, or this is the third. The vast majority of people who follow ethical egoism do not do so on purpose. They do so kind of through enculturation or inculcation, through parental upbringing, or through cultural censure, etc. So it's accidental, which means it's not really practiced. It's just it's a derivative in a way of your normal behaviors. It's also important to realize that law abiding, following the law, is not ethical egoism. That can be, sometimes it can be a mistake that's easy to make, to assume that somebody who is strictly law abiding is solely kind of concerned with this kind of viewpoint that, if I follow the laws, then those are my bumpers, right? If I stay between the law, then I'm doing the right thing. Laws don't care about how people interact with each other, as long as you're not ripping people off or causing societal chaos. So the distinction between law, and we talked about this a little bit in week 1 and week 2, law and ethics are not the same thing, and we have to make sure that we keep them separate at all times. All right. So being law-abiding might be a moral that you have, but the act of being law-abiding is not a system. Okay. So to sum up, because that's pretty much it for tonight, is kind of getting your head wrapped around that idea, and it's a big idea. So when you're doing your readings, doing your research for this week, finding something on ethical egoism is going to be one of the more difficult, because it's such a broad and discredited way of looking at the world. There are a couple of things that you will have to be careful of. It is not uncommon for egoist systems to be presented as ethics when they're not. They're systems of action. They're ways to kind of build personal integrity, but they're not ethical, because there was no desire to be a good person. So you're probably going to run across at least a handful of times someone calling something like the theory of objectivism an ethical theory. It's not. It's a theory of action, but it is not an ethical system. Objectivism is the kind of decision system that was put in place in a response to some of the theories put forth by Ayn Rand and her works of fiction, Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged and whatnot, right? These are strictly not ethics, right? These are systems of action. They're ways that people might choose to live their life in a way that creates a sense of integrity, but there is no desire to be a good person in those. It's all about self-aggrandizement, and in a lot of ways, it's discriminatory and somewhat destructive, and definitely it's inherently selfish, right? It's concerned solely with the practitioner and not anybody else, which makes it highly exploitive. But yeah, you run into stuff like that. You should be careful. The lecture notes are going to give you the best kind of sense of direction on how to do your research from there. Don't get too stressed out about it. Also, just as another note, there is a difference, slight, but there is a difference between ethical egoism and enlightened egoism. So objectivism is an enlightened egoism. What they mean by enlightened is that you've considered it, right? That you've actually said, this is how I want to live my life, as opposed to just kind of accidentally falling into that way of living. So there's lots of enlightened egoism out there that are just theories of action. Like, this is how I'm going to do things. I'm going to be an exploitive bastard who is happy to discriminate and kind of wring people for as much as I can get out of them before I discard them. And that's just not ethics, right? That's pretty destructive. But people have thought about it and written theory about it and whatnot. So it's enlightened in that way. It's been kind of held up to the light So if you see something that talks about enlightened egoism, look for that desire. Is there an attempt here at someone living a life in which their relationships are positive, right? So with that in mind, videos, the lecture notes are really going to be the most helpful. If you have any questions, get a hold of me this week. I haven't been really good about getting back to people right away, just because we had so many challenges with, especially with the Paul DeCamp process and whatnot. Everything should be finished and migrated, and everybody's in a coherent system now. So I should be able to be a little more responsive. Office hours will now be a little more stable. So if you have a situation that you would like to talk about, or if you're curious about something that you ran across in your readings, get in touch. We'll set up an appointment for office hours, and we can have a talk about that. All right, so any questions?
So essentially the difference between psychological egoism and ethical egoism is that psychological egoism is you're self-centered, but you don't care about how that affects other people. Or with ethical egoism, you think about yourself, but you're still considerate of others.
No.
Okay.
But I can kind of see where that might have kind of come across. Psychological egoism is the worldview that human beings instinctually are born with, right?
Okay.
And it is it's experiential in the sense that it's focused on how we experience the world, how all of our input comes in.
So that's the theory, where the ethical egoism is more of the action towards the theory, like.
Yeah, so psychological egoism isn't an action theory at all. It's a descriptive system. Nobody studies this theory to learn how to act. It's more of a theory of this is how people act, right? Ethical egoism specifically is a system of thought put in place so that you can continue to kind of live with this central focus, but do so in a way that is considerate of other people, right?
Okay.
So the two are very distinctly different, both in kind and in form, right?
Okay.
Any other questions?
That's it for me.
Both other profiles on here have are muted. So if you have questions and you've been talking, all I hear is static.
I don't have any questions.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. Heather, any questions?
Nope.
All right, cool. If something comes up, like I said, get in touch, and have a good week. Talk to you later.
Bye.
All right. Thanks.